stars remain, calling out through blood and pain. Torn apart but not yet broken.
Sensible Hysteria.
Names unspoken.
Book 1, Caper La Verte.
Bonds unshaken.
Intermission, The Tower and the Man Who Climbs.
Now, dear listeners, we find ourselves at a crossroads in this tale, a moment where ambition, deception, and arrogance converge. We have seen Aang, Koga, and Brand teetering on the edge of fate, pursued by forces both known and unknown. We have followed Damas Barlays as he weaves his intricate web of deals, alliances, and whispered exchanges. But the question remains, what does he truly seek? There is something beneath his careful words, something unsaid in the transactions he orchestrates. Damas is holding something back, not just from those around him, but from history itself. The records I have uncovered speak of his dealings, of the power he sought, of the moves he made like a player in some grand and deadly game. But nowhere do they reveal his endgame. The man was a cipher, a shadow within the shadowed halls of Olduvai. And yet, one thing is certain. Damas was a product of his time, shaped by the arrogance of the empire he called home. The Shori, the great skyward empire, were not merely ambitious, they were delusional in their own greatness. Theirs was a civilization that saw the natural laws of the world not as immutable truths, but as challenges to be conquered. They bent magic and science alike to their will, shaping the air itself to carry their cities, reaching into the heavens with hands that would not be denied. They forged alliances with beings beyond mortal comprehension, dictated terms to creatures older than the stars, and carved their laws upon the bones of gods. When they stood against the spawn of Rovagug, when they took part in his banishment, they did so not as mortals trembling before divine power, but as equals. They believed themselves to be on par with the celestial order, no longer mere mortals, but something greater. And in their greatest folly, they built not just machines or cities, but something far more audacious. They built gods of their own making. For what is a god but power beyond comprehension? And what is power but a thing to be harnessed? Thus we come to the Tower of Law, the pillar of order that held dominion over the laws of Olduvai, and the place where power was not merely wielded, but forged. Standing like an unyielding monolith at the heart of the First Corps, the Tower of Law was the spine of the city's authority. It rose high above the other structures, a constant reminder that within its walls, the gears of judgment and control turned ceaselessly. It was here that the judges passed their verdicts, where the elite of the empire dictated the fate of those who dared challenge the established order. But law, dear listeners, is not the same as justice. The Tower of Law was never a place of fairness. It was a place of control. Beneath the pristine image of order and civility, corruption festered like rot beneath a golden mask. The judges of the tower were not merely enforcers of law. They were sculptors of reality itself. The words they spoke did not merely dictate legal precedent. They rewrote history. They reshaped truth. It was in this place that the powers of Olduvai accomplished something truly obscene. They manufactured a god before the eyes of the people. But who, dear listeners, would dare to undertake such an act? Who among the ruling elite had the vision, the arrogance, the sheer audacity to turn law into divinity? Look no further than the 5 families, the bloodlines that ruled the First Corps from the shadows, their influence stretching into every crevice of power. The names of these families, old as the empire itself, are whispered with reverence and fear, for they were not merely aristocrats. They were engineers of civilization, architects of the Shorei's ascension, and perhaps its greatest sin. Each family had their domain, their sphere of influence, and together they formed an unbreakable web of power. The Asimov family, the lawbringers, the hammer that shaped the very structure of the empire. Grand Sky Marshal Ekon. Asimov VI ruled his family with the same unwavering authority that he wielded over the military courts. To the Asimovs, law was absolute, and it was their hands that ensured it remained so. If a god was to be created, it would be they who enforced its will. The Barley's family, the Watchers of Coin, whose grasp over the city's economy made them indispensable. Their leader, Sidal, wielded her influence like a blade, a woman whose whispers carried more weight than any written decree. The Barley's family did not simply control wealth, they controlled power itself. If a god was to be built, it would be funded by their vaults, and perhaps their motives. The Men's Fad family, the outsiders who became the inner circle. A Kayal family, the first non-humans to claim a seat among the ruling elite, their luminous yellow eyes watching over Olduvai with an eerie wisdom. Their connections stretched far beyond mere wealth or influence. They knew the hidden paths, the unseen hands at work. If a god was created, the Men's Fad knew of it before any others, and perhaps they ensured its place in history. The Onasi family, the power brokers. A family that rose quickly, too quickly. Their ascent whispered about in the corners of power. Their connections to Eliseo Nev, the Sky Master of Coin, meant that their wealth and influence were tied to forces far beyond what most could comprehend. The Onasi were not supposed to exist at the level they did, and yet there they stood. If a god was made, it was likely the Onasi who brokered the deals to make it happen. The Sivij family, the Eternal Watchers, led by the vampire Luvik Sivij, a being who openly embraced his heritage while securing his place in the Empire's highest halls. He did not command armies, nor did he need to. His presence within the Tower of Law was enough. He spent time there, studied its inner workings. A man who had no need to die could afford to be patient. If a god was made within that tower, Sievij knew the truth. Perhaps he was even the one who whispered it into existence. Yet there are whispers of something else. Something beyond the five families. A shadow, an influence that lingers just out of sight. It is not written in the ledgers, nor spoken in the grand halls of Olduvai, but it is felt. A force that moves within the Tower of Law, shaping its judgments, bending its will, not through wealth or power alone, but through something deeper, something older. Damas Barlays was careful in his dealings. He was meticulous. And yet in every record, in every step of his path, there is a gap, an absence, a presence unseen but undeniably there. The five families built Olduvai. They ruled it. But did they truly hold all the strings? Or did something else? Something patient. Something that did not need to rule in the open, but only to whisper in the ears of those who did. If such a force existed, it would not be in the histories. It would not leave records. It would leave belief. And belief, dear listeners, is the most powerful weapon of all.
Chapter 10. Through the Gate.
The streets of the First Corps were nothing like the seedy corners of the city the Four were used to. Here the air was crisp, the cobblestone streets polished, and the towering ivory spires of the district gleamed in the daylight, standing like monuments to order and power. Aang, Brand, Koga, and Damas walked in formation, their steps purposeful, heading straight for the Tower of Law, the beating heart of the city's greatest advancements, and more importantly, the gatekeeper to the maximum security prison. Once again, the three were back in military uniforms, their disguises giving them a sense of authority, as they moved through the pristine streets. The uniforms were clean, crisp, and borrowed from someone who would eventually notice, but for now, they served their purpose. Koga walked with his shoulders tight, his head on a constant swivel. He scanned every alley, every open window, every shadow, his fingers twitching toward the hilt of his blade.
Paranoid much?
Brand quipped, hands tucked behind his head as he strolled alongside him. Koga didn't bother hiding his unease.
The last time we had a job this big, a red-eyed lunatic tried to shoot me in the face. Forgive me if I don't feel safe walking in broad daylight.
Damas, walking a step ahead, smirked without turning back.
The first corps is the last place someone would dare try something. Too many watchful eyes, too many laws.
Ung huffed.
That'd be more comforting if we weren't actively trying to break into a maximum security prison.
Damas chuckled.
Fair.
They walked in silence for a while, the towering white obelisk of the Tower of Law looming ever closer. The streets here were pristine, filled with officials in fine robes, scholars in heavy cloaks, and engineers discussing advancements that would shape the empire. Their own disguises blended them in well enough. No one questioned men in military dress moving through the district. But the weight of the deception sat heavy on their shoulders. Then Damas spoke again, smooth, deliberate.
The prison we're about to infiltrate,
He began.
isn't just a fortress. It's run by the 055.
Ang frowned, glancing at him.
That doesn't make any sense.
Damas raised a brow.
Why not?
Because the 055 are diplomats.
Ang said.
They run the Empire's trade, espionage, foreign relations, not prisons.
Brand snorted.
Oh, I can't wait to hear the real answer.
Damas's smirk widened.
Then allow me to educate you.
He slowed his pace slightly, letting his words settle, watching their reactions.
The 055 isn't just a collection of diplomats.
He said.
They're a shadow force, the real power behind Ulduvar's control over the unknown. Every anomaly, everything that goes bump in the night, every artifact, creature, or force that refuses to bend the knee to the Empire. They either collect it or destroy it.
Ang's jaw tightened. As they moved through the pristine streets, Brand shot a glance at Koga, eyeing him with a mockingly critical look.
You got enough healing magic after last night, yeah?
He asked, voice casual, but laced with something pointed.
Can't have you slowing us down because you're still nursing wounds from our graceful escape.
Koga's fingers twitched slightly, but his voice was even when he responded.
I went to Cassandra. Church has no idea. I cover my tracks.
Brand's smirk widened slightly.
Smart move. Almost like you know what you're doing.
Koga's eye twitched.
Are you implying that I don't?
Brand made a small, amused noise, but didn't answer. Ang let out a long, suffering sigh, rolling his shoulders as he walked.
Shut up, both of you.
He muttered.
I actually want to hear what the hell Damas is saying.
Damas, walking ahead, barely reacted. Just the slightest smirk, as if he'd expected the argument before it even started.
As I was saying,
He continued smoothly.
the 055 doesn't just deal with politics. They're curators of power. And if they have something as big as a man-made god locked away, well, let's just say it's not alone down there.
The weight of that statement settled over them. Whatever they were walking into, it was far bigger than any of them had anticipated.
They don't just negotiate with foreign nations.
Damas continued.
They hunt the things that the rest of the city doesn't want to believe exist. The monsters in the dark, the powerful relics that can't be controlled, the beings that refuse to be categorized.
He gestured vaguely toward the looming prison complex ahead.
And when something is too dangerous to kill outright, but too valuable to let loose, they don't destroy it, they lock it away.
Koga exhaled, shaking his head.
This just keeps getting worse.
Brand, however, looked thoroughly amused.
So what I'm hearing
He said, grinning.
is that we're about to break into a prison controlled by a secret vault of nightmares. I mean, honestly, this is getting ridiculous.
Ang shot him a look.
You just figured that out?
Brand shrugged.
I always knew this was stupid. I just didn't realize how stupid.
Damas chuckled, clearly enjoying their reactions.
Welcome to the real Olduvai,
He said smoothly.
where the worst monsters don't lurk in the shadows. They sit behind desks deciding what gets to stay hidden.
Then he added, almost too casually,
And if they're hiding something as big as a man-made god, imagine what else might be under the 055's roof.
The Tower of Law loomed ahead, a colossal white obelisk, its polished stone surface gleaming under the midday sun. It stood imperious among the other buildings of the First Corps, its sheer presence commanding obedience, a monument to the bureaucratic machine that ruled over Olduvai with an iron quill and a paper cage. As Damas, Ang, Brand, and Koga approached, their borrowed military uniforms allowed them to move unquestioned, blending into the rigid order of the district. Their boots struck the cobblestone pavement in even, measured strides, the weight of their mission settling over them like a tightening noose. The streets were pristine, eerily quiet, despite the bustle of robed officials, scholars, and bureaucrats drifting between the ivory-colored buildings. Guards in ceremonial black and gold uniforms stood at rigid attention along the main boulevard, their faces stoic, their hands resting lightly on their weapons, a silent reminder that, here, order was absolute. Ahead, the security checkpoint leading into the tower was a maze of wooden counters, brass fixtures, and uniformed officers, an operation as efficient as it was invasive. Lines of people moved through in strict order, each individual stopping to present their documents, their belongings searched, their movements scrutinized. The air was thick with the sound of papers shuffling, typewriters clacking, and clipped conversations exchanged in curt, officious tones. At the front of the checkpoint, positioned like an authority over the entire operation, stood a Derhi woman. And the moment Ang saw her, his stomach dropped. He knew her, and she knew him. The Derhi stood with a sharp, commanding presence, her broad shoulders squared, wings tucked neatly against her back, her sharp eyes scanning the checkpoint like a hawk surveying its territory. Unlike the night before, where she had been graceful, wild, and dressed for pleasure, she now wore a trim, double-breasted security uniform, pressed to perfection, with a brass badge pinned to her chest. But her eyes still burned with the same intensity as before. And the moment she spotted Ang, a slow, knowing smile curled across her lips. Ang immediately looked away, mortified. Brand, standing just behind him, noticed instantly and grinned like a demon.
Oh,
Brand whispered, his voice dripping with pure amusement. Ang wanted to die. Before Brand could fully weaponize the situation, Damas suddenly clapped his hands together.
This
He declared smoothly.
is perfect.
Ang turned to glare at him.
How is this perfect?
Damas's smirk was infuriatingly self-assured.
Because we need a distraction, and you, my friend, have already established a rapport with our dear checkpoint officer.
Ang froze. Koga crossed his arms, deadpan.
Oh yeah, this'll go well.
Damas placed a hand on Ang's shoulder.
All you need to do is hold her attention. Give us just enough time to get through without proper inspection.
Brand clapped Ang on the back, gleeful.
think of it as returning the favor from last night, or the night before.
Ang with discontent in his voice.
I hate everything about this, but fine. Fine.
He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders before striding forward, mentally bracing himself for the awkwardness to come. As he approached, Claire turned to face him fully, her wings twitching slightly in what Ang had learned was a Derhi's version of amusement.
Well,
She purred, crossing her arms as she looked him up and down.
Few human men can keep up with me for one night, but you managed 2 in a row. 3 in a row, I might accommodate.
Aang rubbed the back of his neck, shifting slightly under her gaze.
Yeah, didn't know you. Worked here.
She smirked, stepping closer.
And I didn't know you were so versatile.
She teased, tapping a finger against his borrowed military uniform.
Military man by day, dancer by night? What's next, nobleman?
He chuckled, finally finding his rhythm.
Only if it gets me an invite to your place without having to win a dance first.
Claire's eyes gleamed, her grin sharpening.
Oh? Switching tactics now.
I just appreciate efficiency.
Behind her, the rest of the group quietly slipped past the checkpoint, moving steadily toward the main entrance. But just as they were almost clear, Brand, because he was Brand, couldn't resist. He made a ridiculous, exaggerated, kissy face behind Claire's back, mouthing something obscene at Aang. Aang almost broke, almost let his eyes flick toward Brand. But Claire noticed. Her sharp Durhai instincts picked up the smallest shift in his posture, and she started to turn. Thinking fast, Aang reached for her hand, gently pulling her back toward him before she could look behind.
You know,
He said smoothly, forcing a charming smile.
we, never did get to finish our talk about a rematch.
Claire raised an eyebrow.
Oh? Are you finally admitting you lost?
I'm saying I deserve a second chance.
She hummed, considering, then leaned in slightly, her warm breath just brushing against his ear.
Then you'll meet me at my place tonight. Not a club, not a bar. My place.
Aang hesitated for half a second. Then he caught the tail end of Brand, escaping past the checkpoint, disappearing through the doors with Koga and Damas in tow. Aang sighed, barely suppressing the reluctant smirk that pulled at his lips.
All right,
He muttered.
your place.
Claire looked pleased.
Good.
She stepped back, finally allowing him to pass.
Try not to get yourself extra duty before then.
Aang offered a quick mock salute before striding past the checkpoint, his face still warm from the exchange. As soon as he rounded the corner and caught up with the others, Brand immediately burst into laughter.
Oh, that was beautiful.
Koga shook his head.
I can't believe that actually worked.
Damas, ever composed, simply patted Aang on the back.
Flawless execution, my dear boy.
Aang groaned, rubbing his face.
I hate all of you.
Brand, still grinning ear to ear, slung an arm over Aang's shoulders.
Nah, you love us. Just maybe not as much as you love a certain winged woman.
Aang muttered a long string of curses under his breath, but at least they were inside.
Chapter 11. 2 days from retirement.
The four moved swiftly through the halls of the Tower of Law, their stolen military uniforms giving them the illusion of belonging as they passed clerks, officers, and robed officials too busy with their own affairs to pay them close attention. Their destination was the elevator to the maximum security levels, the entrance to the city's deepest vault of secrets, where the most dangerous beings, artifacts, and knowledge were locked away beneath layers of stone, steel, and law. Damas led the way, his movements smooth, his confidence unwavering. He moved as if he owned the place, as if the walls themselves bent to accommodate him. The others followed, silent but watchful, knowing they were one wrong step away from everything coming undone. Then, just as they neared the elevator doors, a problem presented itself. A fat guard slouched against the wall beside the lift, chewing lazily on what smelled like spiced jerky, eyes half-lidded with boredom. His uniform strained against his bulk, his belt barely holding his gut in check. But his hand rested comfortably on his club, and when he saw them approaching, his expression immediately soured.
You lot ain't authorized to be here.
He grunted, straightening only slightly.
Turn around.
For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Damas stepped forward, offering his most winning smile.
My good man,
He said, his voice like warm honey.
I believe there's been a misunderstanding.
He lifted his hand, fingers subtly weaving the threads of charm magic into his words. The change was immediate. The guard's rigid posture melted, his scowl turning into a broad, stupid grin. His eyes gleamed with sudden camaraderie, like he was greeting old friends he hadn't seen in years.
Well, why didn't you say so?
The guard beamed, clapping Damas on the back with a heavy, meaty hand.
No trouble at all, boys. You should have led with that.
Brand coughed to cover his laugh. Aang exhaled through his nose. Koga rolled his eyes. The guard puffed up proudly, stepping aside with a theatrical flourish.
Name's Bert, by the way.
He said cheerfully.
And I am 2 days, 2 glorious days, away from retirement.
He sighed, his tone wistful.
Gonna spend my days fishing out near the clouds, living life real easy.
Damas smiled.
That sounds wonderful, Bert.
Bert nodded enthusiastically.
Damn right it does. But enough about me. Come on, I'll ride down with you. Make sure no one gives you trouble.
As he stepped onto the elevator with them, Damas and Koga exchanged a look.
We're going to have to kill him.
Koga said flatly, keeping his voice low as the doors slid closed.
Obviously.
Damas agreed smoothly.
He's seen our faces, and once the magic wears off.
He gave a deliberate shrug. Aang stiffened, shooting them both a glare.
You're joking, right? The guy's 2 days from retirement.
Koga sighed, rubbing his temples.
He's also going to remember us breaking into a maximum security prison.
So,
Aang crossed his arms.
we knock him out, leave him somewhere. He doesn't have to die.
Surprisingly, Brand nodded.
I hate to say it, but I'm with Aang on this one.
Damas arched a brow.
You're going soft, Brand.
Brand smirked.
No, I just have a rule, never kill a man 2 days from retirement.
Koga stared at him.
That's insane.
Brand shrugged.
So is killing a guy who just wants to go fishing.
Damas let out a hum, intrigued but not entirely convinced.
Well, I suppose we can table the discussion.
At that moment, the elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal the heavily reinforced corridors of maximum security. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a cold metallic room, its walls smooth and unadorned. The only exit was a large reinforced door, devoid of a handle or keyhole, marked only by a strange recessed slot, a mechanism that required something specific to grant passage. The air was sterile, thick with the hum of unseen machinery. The space felt deliberately isolating, a waiting chamber meant to deter anyone who didn't belong. The four stepped inside, the elevator doors sealing shut behind them with a heavy clunk. Damas turned to Bert, his charmed new best friend, and clapped him on the shoulder.
Bert, my friend, you've done more than enough for us today,
He said smoothly.
Now I need you to head back upstairs and make sure no one knows we're here. Not a single person. Got it?
Bert nodded enthusiastically, saluting with far too much gusto.
You got it, pal.
He said.
Not a single soul. I swear on my fishing rod.
Damas ushered him toward the elevator, making sure the man was inside before pressing the up button himself. The doors began to slide closed. Koga, watching the exchange, narrowed his eyes.
You were gonna stab him the second he turned his back, weren't you?
He muttered. Damas only smiled.
Of course not.
The doors finished closing.
Would have been the second after the door shut.
Koga exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples.
What now?
He asked, voice tight, the strain of his waning trust evident. Damas pulled something from his coat. The parchment still stained with a bloody handprint, its edges aged and delicate, but charged with something unseen.
Now.
Damas murmured, holding the contract between his fingers.
Now we wait.
He leaned in slightly, whispering something in a language none of them recognized, his voice curling around the arcane syllables like a key sliding into a lock. The room remained silent for a moment. Then, with a faint hiss, the reinforced door clicked and slid open. On the other side stood a brown-haired dwarf, her eyes distant, unfocused, her movements slow and mechanical, as though she had been pulled from deep within a dream she wasn't aware she was having. North Stonecall. Brand, who was never one to waste an opportunity, leaned against the doorway with his usual easy smirk.
Well, well, well.
He drawled, eyes flicking over her.
If I knew we'd be seeing each other again so soon, I would have brought flowers.
North didn't react, didn't blink, didn't even seem to register Brand's words. She simply stood there, waiting. Brand frowned, the flirty facade slipping slightly.
All right, I know my charms are devastating, but usually they at least get a smirk.
She doesn't know what's happening, Brand.
Damas cut in, bored.
She's bound to her contract. She's in a fugue state.
Brand's smirk faltered further. His amusement dampened as he looked back at North's blank expression.
That's unsettling,
he muttered. Damas stepped forward, slipping easily into his usual role of command. He met North's empty gaze, his voice soft but undeniable.
Escort us,
he said,
to the prisoner who has been here the longest.
North blinked once, her body stiffening slightly, before she turned without a word and began to walk. The four followed, silent, their boots echoing against the cold metal floor. Koga stole a glance at the lifeless expression on North's face.
This whole job
He muttered under his breath.
just keeps getting worse.
The air in the maximum security wing was thick, sterile, and wrong. North Stonecall led them through a corridor of cells, her steps even, her expression empty. The metal walls hummed faintly, the oppressive silence pressing against their ears like a force of its own. There was no sound of inmates screaming or rattling bars, only the occasional flicker of arcane lights, the low hum of machines, and the hushed whispers of things that should not be. The first cell they passed housed a man with sickly gray skin, his flesh appearing as though it had been stapled on in patches. His eyes were milky, his lips cracked, but as they approached, he pressed himself against the iron bars, one trembling hand reaching out toward them.
I can fix you,
he whispered, voice raspy and wet, his fingers twitching in desperation.
You're all broken. I can fix you.
They kept walking. The man's whisper grew frantic.
She's close now.
He rasped.
I can feel her. She's waiting. I just need to find her.
Ang tensed, but didn't look back. Damas, leading the group, spoke only once.
Do not interact with anything here.
They passed a blank wall where a cell should have been. It was identical to the surrounding metal, seamless, undisturbed, yet there was an unmistakable presence behind it, something watching. None of them stopped to question it. At the end of the hall, an open cell door revealed an old man, hunched and unkempt, his ragged robes pooling around him like a discarded tapestry. A golden crown sat atop his filthy, matted hair, tarnished with time. His eyes were dim, unfocused, yet they seemed to see everything. Brand raised an eyebrow.
Okay, so that's a trap.
Damas's voice was sharp.
Do not interact with anything here.
They moved on. The next cell was different. Instead of metal bars, reinforced glass enclosed the room, with only a few small air holes drilled into its surface. Inside, a little girl, no older than 6, hopped back and forth in a game of hopscotch. But her body was wrong. Her tiny arms and legs were laced with steel plating, thin cables running through her joints, her eyes softly glowing with an eerie blue light. Tiny tubes and wires curled from the back of her partly shaved head, snaking into her back. As they passed, she paused mid-hop, tilting her head toward them. Then, in a sing-song voice, she began to rhyme.
Tick-tock, tick-tock. Time runs out upon the clock. The game begins. I've had to wait. Puck, oh Puck, won't it be great?
A shiver ran down Aang's spine. Brand muttered under his breath.
All right, definitely a trap.
Damas didn't acknowledge her. He kept walking. Then, as they approached the next cell, tiny hands gripped the bars, and Koga's blood ran cold. The clown doll was waiting for him. It grinned, rocking back and forth on the balls of its tiny feet, its painted-on smile too wide, too eager.
You found me!
It sang softly, gripping the bars like a child clutching a toy chest.
Oh, clever, clever Koga.
Koga scowled.
How the fuck did you get in here?
The doll giggled.
I go where I'm needed.
Its painted eyes flicked toward the hallway ahead.
And oh, you're going to need me.
Damas barely gave the cell a glance.
Leave it.
Koga hesitated. The doll pressed its tiny face to the bars.
Let me out. I promise not to help the red-eyed man anymore.
Koga's jaw tightened.
Stay the hell away from me.
But then, he stopped. He thought. The doll could move unseen. It got places it shouldn't be. It had no loyalty, only the thrill of chaos and knives.
We should take it,
he muttered. Damas didn't stop walking.
No.
Koga frowned.
We could use it.
Damas sighed, exasperated.
And we could also set fire to our own uniforms and walk in naked. What's your point?
Koga's fingers twitched, but after a moment's pause, he stepped away from the bars.
Fine.
His voice was low, his words careful.
But if I come back, and you keep your word, then you serve me.
The doll beamed, tilting its head.
Deal!
They moved on. The last cell was different. The glow hit them first, deep red, spilling from the edges of the reinforced bars, flickering like flames licking at the walls. Unlike the others, they couldn't see inside, only feel the oppressive heat, the weight of something powerful pressing against the air. Brand slowed his pace, eyes flicking to Damas.
This it?
Damas nodded, stepping forward.
Norith,
he said smoothly, turning back to his hypnotized pawn.
Open the...
A voice boomed down the hall, rattling the very walls.
Not one escape. Not while I still draw breath.
The air shook as a massive figure descended from above, wings spread wide. A Derhi, taller than any they had seen before, his body a wall of muscle, his uniform adorned with heavy military medals. His black and gold officer's coat did nothing to soften the imposing sight of him, and in his hands he wielded a bastard sword the size of a man, its blade already drawn. His face was a portrait of command and fury, his voice like a war horn made flesh.
You will go no further.
A dozen guards followed in his wake, each armed with steel and spell alike. Koga cursed. Aang clenched for his fists and took a fighting stance. Brand grinned. Damas, for the first time, didn't have a smug remark. The Derhi commander raised his blade.
None shall escape this prison while I yet live. So proclaims I, Sergeant Hawkluff.
Skyborn kingdom built on high, but rust and ruin stain the sky. Chains are breaking, ghosts arise, whispers carve through shattered minds. Watch the fall, hear the cries. Truth is lost in it'll divide. whisper seeds are sown.